I'm pleased to be joined by a great group of local civic leaders today for a discussion on our city sports strategy, past and present. We're about to have, once again, the eyes of the world on Indy as we host an event that has never been hosted in any one city before, the entire NCAA men's basketball tournament. We couldn't have a better group to discuss how we came to this point in time and where we might go from here with our sports strategy. We're joined by Mark Miles, President and CEO of Penske Entertainment, which of course includes the Indianapolis Motor Speedway and IndyCar. Allison Melangton, Senior Vice President of Penske Entertainment. John Thompson, local businessman and community and civic leader. He served as chairman of the Indianapolis Chamber of Commerce. He's a founding member of the Indiana Economic Development Corporation board, started right when it was founded. Served on the board of the Central Indiana Corporate Partnership. He's serving on the NBA All-Star Committee, the Indianapolis Championships Fund, and many more local boards. We're joined also by current president of the Sports Corporation, Ryan Vaughn, and also a former Indianapolis City County Council president. And last but not least, Susan Williams, who is also a past president of Sports Corporation, the Indiana Sports Corporation, and also a former city council representative. So thank you all very much for joining. I know it's going to be a fun conversation. I'm going to start with a question regarding the history of our sports strategy. And I know many of you were involved in the early days of this effort. And I'd just like to get your recollections of how you recall that decision was made, to the extent it was, a day or a time to begin the focus on sports as an economic development strategy. How intentional was it? What is your recollection of the early days? And I know there's a number of you, like I said, who have worked on that effort, but maybe I'll start, Mark, with you and your recollections.
Thanks, Nate, and thanks to you and the IBJ for making this possible. It's a pleasure to be part of it. I just want to say I've been on a couple of Zoom calls like this with John Thompson during the pandemic, and I'm just so envious of his den and that Rembrandt behind him on the wall. Look, and hello to everybody else on the panel. I know I get this question because I'm easily the oldest on the panel, and was kind of around near the beginning of this. In some ways, I think the strategy evolved. In a real sense, I mean, there were people both in the private sector and in government who believed that we had to make Indianapolis's downtown into a vibrant downtown. And there were a number of ideas about how to do that, and sports was certainly one of them. But necessity is the mother of invention, and in the late 60s and early 70s, we were about to lose the only professional franchise we had, the ABA Pacers, and which was playing, hard for people today to imagine, but they were playing at the Coliseum at the State Fairgrounds. So private sector folks, then Mayor Lugar and others came together to get the Pacers stabilized and moved downtown, and what really was the first venue downtown, Market Square Arena, in 1974. And then there was a tennis venue built, and then the Congress passed an act which created national governing bodies for each of the Olympic sports, and local folks rallied around an effort to bring many of their headquarters here, which was great because it allowed our community to get really close to some of the key sports. And then we realized they have big events. And big events are super because it brings other people's money here. They spend their money in our hotels and our restaurants. It puts us on television, which gives us great branding opportunities for the city. And then things kind of exploded. So in my mind, it really began around, call it 1970, the very early 70s. It was very pointed at the beginning to do certain specific things, and it evolved into an understanding that we could be phenomenal in and really create for our city the leadership position in the national sports event hosting, what now is looked at as a very competitive market.
Thank you, Susan. How about I know you were around some of those early days. What are your recollections in terms of thinking about sports as an opportunity for the city?
Well, thanks, Nate, for including me on this. This is very fun. Mark sort of did the outline very well. There are a couple things that I think are important to sort of flavor that up a little bit. I think the Pacer deal was critical, and I agree with that. And sometimes we forget, and maybe we don't forget. Maybe we're not old enough to remember, but I remember. and I also remember the debate around putting Market Square Arena downtown. That was huge, and Luger caught a lot of flack about that. It was really interesting because, to me, that's when I first got really interested in politics. And what struck me was the political will was so strong that people were able to take that flack and just move forward, unlike today. It was the same thing when Bill Hudnut decided to build a multi-purpose venue with no football team. And it was kind of a build it and they will come attitude, but there was the political will to do that. So I think that's really important in terms of leadership around what was going on. The other thing that I think is really important was, we picked sports as the centerpiece because it brings people together and it's exciting and so forth. But along with that, the community really invested heavily in arts and culture with the renovation of what's now the IRT and the Circle Theater, the White River State Park, and that vision to get rid of that sort of wasteland down there and replace it with something wonderful, gave the city not only the excitement of sports, but the quality of life. And I think the sports strategy was very important for economic development. But we moved downtown in 1981. And so I remember sort of what it was like. And I think it was equally as important in terms of making the community feel better about ourselves. I mean, I think it really lifted, particularly after the National Sports Festival, that self-image and that, this really is a great city, not just a nice suburb to raise our kids. So right. I think that's an important overlay too, to the historical piece that Mark presented.
Allison, do you have any thoughts on the early days?
Yeah, actually, I'm a product of the sports movement because I was living in Colorado in 1983, and I worked at the U.S. Olympic Committee in 1982 when Indianapolis hosted the National Sports Festival. And it was amazing because I'd never been to Indiana, and I kept hearing all of the talk about what Indianapolis was doing and how amazing it was. And if you really wanted a career as a young professional in sports, you should move to Indianapolis. So that's what I did. Mark mentioned the NGBs, the national governing bodies of the various sports. They moved several, I think it was 7 at the same time to Indianapolis. And I moved to Indiana sight unseen as a product of that and went to work at one of the national governing bodies. And I did that based on the reputation that Indianapolis was building. Sandy Knapp had come out, and I was at a U.S. Olympic Committee meeting when she laid out the plan for the National Sports Festival. She was the founding leader of the Indiana Sports Corporation, and she was a salesperson. She sold everybody at the USOC. It was going to be the best national sports festival in the history of the event, and it was. And after that, and meeting Sandy, meeting a number of the leaders in Indianapolis, I couldn't wait to move there, and so I did it. So it was a great move on the city's thinking ahead and getting ahead of all the other cities that were starting to think about it. We were the first sports commission in 1979 ever founded, and Ryan would know this number, but I think there's over 500 of them now. So we invented an industry and moved people like myself and lots of other young professionals to Indiana for that movement.
That's amazing. John, do you have any thoughts in terms of, and remind us when you became an Indianapolis citizen and when your involvement in some of the local organizations began?
I moved here in 1984. To be exact, February 5th, not for sports, but to join Mays Chemical with the idea of maybe 3 years later moving back to New York City and opening my own chemical distributorship. And I was quite struck immediately by the community and civic engagement here It was very different than anywhere else I'd lived. Even though I was in my 20s, I'd lived in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, born and raised in Baltimore, but I had never seen that kind of civic engagement. In fact, Gary Dick came out to Mays Chemical. Something was going on, and he interviewed me 2 months after being here and asked me what did I think about the city. And I told him that that was a surprising positive that I hadn't seen anywhere else. And I think that's one of the fundamental ingredients in our success as we launch that sports strategy. And I took credit for the Colts because I'm born and raised in Baltimore. I was a Colts fan, and Dave Frick took exception to that because he said he brought him here. But the one thing I will say, I called my mother and I said, Ma, these people, their elevator don't reach the top floor because they built a football stadium and they don't have a team. I called her back about a month later and said, Ma, it goes above the top floor. They have your team because we had gotten the Colts. And I realized right away that there was a sports strategy here that was differentiating from other communities, and it was working. The other part of that initial period for me in 1984 was I got here, and right away we're launching Circle City Classic. So we got the Colts, then we got the Circle City Classic, which if you remember, in the early years, first 5, 6, 7 years, Classics sold out the Dome. We completely sold it out. And there were only 8 Classics at that time in the country, historically Black colleges playing football in Classic games. And so we were a big success that, like the Sports Corporation, set the model for the rest of the country. By the 2003 or so, there was 66 Classics in the country, and we started to see our attendance erode because Dayton had their own, St. Louis, Chicago, Detroit. So, but still, the strategy was in place, and our Classic is still alive and brings some cultural diversity to our sports strategy.
Thank you, John. Ryan, I've got a question for you. You were probably not born yet when that strategy started. So you're the youngest of the group here, but now you're in the prime pole position at the Sports Corp. And I'm curious, how has this legacy that we just heard about impacted your role at the Sports Corp? And we also just heard that we were the first to form a sports corporation. Now, I think you said there are 500 or so. What is that competition like now? And again, kind of relating back to that legacy, how does the legacy help us continue to compete and do so well?
Yeah, thanks, Nate, and thanks for having me. I guess before I get to that, this panel gives me the opportunity to just say thank you for all these people that started working on this sports strategy so long ago. It's interesting to hear them talk about these key moments in the development and how it impacted, my life growing up, sort of unconsciously realizing that there was a sports strategy. I mean, I learned how to swim with free community swim lessons at the newly opened IU Natatorium in 1982. And I played in the youth soccer tournament around the Pan Am Games. All these special memories come rushing back. And of course, then I didn't appreciate all the work and effort that went in to make it possible. But the legacy is tremendous. To your point, it's the thing that makes us the most special. I mean, the opportunities that we have today, hosting March Madness, hosting, our 8th Final Four, attracting college football playoff, is really built on a reputation that, started 40 plus years ago of delivering high quality events and actually making each of those events better. And so, one of the great joys I've had leading the Indiana Sports Corp is sort of this conversation Allison and I had in the transition, which was, hey, there's a ton of people in this community that have invested a lot of time, energy, money, and effort to make this successful. They're all here to support you. You're not alone. It's the leading strategy in the city. Just don't screw it up and don't be afraid to call us, right? And it's been true. I mean, I call Mark, I call Allison, Susan and I have met, John. We talk about this on the various boards we serve on together. The whole community, whether they're still involved or they were once involved, they care passionately about the sports strategy, and they're always there to be helpful.
Thank you, Ryan. Let's talk a little bit about economic impact. And I know, John, you've been on the board of the IEDC from the get-go. And but all of you, Mark, you've served on CICP leadership over the years, and a lot of you have in that regard. I read something recently that said that just getting the NCAA headquarters to Indianapolis back in 99, 2000, that there's been over $1 billion of economic impact, but which is astounding. So how do you all see the economic impact? Maybe start with John from your vantage point and different service you provided to the state and city. How do you view economic impact?
Sports has had a tremendous economic impact on the state, and it's come in so many varied directions. And the impact's been felt in virtually all 92 counties. I know for sure when we built the dome, I know, and then subsequent to that, the work on the convention center and Bankers Life, 91 counties have participated in supplying goods and services to those facilities and sports organizations. And it would be tough to think of the restaurant, hotel, and entertainment climate in Indiana without the energy and the facilities and that sports has brought to the state. I mean, across the board, sports been the marginal economic factor that's made it all work. Could you have, a JW Marriott if you had no sports, and all that sports has brought. And so you go from service contracts to those facilities and those teams, and you can see a huge impact there. And then the last thing I'll say, and let someone else chime in, is the talent attraction and retention. Other things have contributed to it, but sports has played a major part in attracting and retaining talent. So even companies and organizations that aren't directly involved in sports, would they relocate here if we didn't have those venues, those teams, and those outlets?
Right. Ryan and Susan, you both served on the city county council. So you got a pretty interesting vantage point from that perspective as deals were done over the years with the different stadiums deals and other sports deals that were done. How did you all view when you're thinking about sports strategy and sports opportunities compared to other economic development opportunities? Of course, a lot of things move forward, but maybe your vantage point from those experiences would be interesting to hear.
I'll start with the early days, and then Ryan can pick up from there. The city county council was very involved because of the approval. The approval of the dome, for example, was couched as a convention center expansion. And so that was politically a little bit tough to deal with, but it happened. And that was terrific. I think the involvement of Lilly Endowment, building the venues for the Pan Am games, which we haven't really talked about. That's where Mark got his start, at least in the public eye. Getting those venues built was just a huge value add to the city. And the city of Indianapolis, I don't know what percentage it is now. Back in the day, when I was there, it was like 50% of the property in Indianapolis was not taxable. And so there was no tax base to do much of anything that we really needed to focus on. And so this became kind of a promise for the future. And then the other thing, the civic pride not only from the corporations, but from the volunteers and the people that were just pumped. I mean, they would do anything for a hat and a shirt. I mean, it was terrific. And it was so exciting. And it created a buzz in Indianapolis, and particularly about the center, that made things politically easier, honestly. It was hard for the Star and the News at the time to give us too much grief about what was going on when we had the community so pumped up. And I think, and just to segue on what John says and to get my 2 cents worth in, when you talk about retention, and when I was trying to kind of reinvigorate membership and involvement in the sports corporation, when I went to the companies, the value added to them was these key volunteer opportunities. And I was able to sell them a big package if I would guarantee them 50 volunteer spots, because that was a huge retention tool and a good way to get their people networking with people in other businesses and so forth. So, there's just so much non-quantifiable value to this. My gosh, I don't know, I obviously got the same thing when I could pick up the phone and call Jim Nance and say, hey, when you're in the town, would you have breakfast with a bunch of our donors and chat them up? Sure. I mean, the sports commentators love this place and they can't say enough about it. And when they say it on TV, talk about value added. It's incredible. So anyway, politically, then that gives you what you need to be able to be courageous and to do bold things.
Yeah. Ryan?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think sports, the idea of sports and our ability to attract major sporting events and conventions always makes those political conversations around economic development opportunities a lot easier. One of my first votes ever as a new city councilor was actually to authorize the issuance of debt for Lucas Oil Stadium. And the argument was less about Lucas Oil, but it was also about doubling the size of the convention center, what that could mean for bringing on board the JW Marriott, and you talk about the impact, just those two things, those three buildings alone have had on our downtown is tremendous, right? Our ability to do convention business literally almost doubled overnight. The size of the conventions we can have multiple conventions at the same time. Because of the JW and because of Lucas Oil, we were able to do things like the Super Bowl, which, Mark can agree or disagree, but I doubt would have happened if we were still playing football in the Hoosier Dome, right? And here we are, fast forward to just this past summer, in the middle of a pandemic, with a bipartisan unanimous approval by the City County Council to reinvest in Pan Am Plaza and add another 1,400 hotel rooms to support the business of sports and conventions. So it's always made the conversation easier. And what's made it easier is that it's always worked. It continues to grow and invest in downtown.
So Susan mentioned something special. I want to go to Mark and Allison that I think is special about our city, and that's volunteerism. And it feels to me, but both of you will have some insights on this, that some of that started around the time the Pan Am Games was one of the big events that kind of really energized the community. And Mark, you recently in one of the IBJ interviews or discussions you had with us mentioned that the city over delivers, and that's our secret sauce. And then you weren't talking just about sports, but I'm curious from both of your perspectives, having been involved early in the Pan Am Games, maybe being one of those pivotal moments for the city. How volunteerism then, you saw it when you came into that, how it may have grown over the years, and you've both been involved over the years, and kind of where it is today.
I'm happy to speak to that quickly, but let me go back and make maybe one other comment that's kind of about the economics here, and it's not going to be a bunch of data points, but in 1970, I think it's important for people, not in my mind, not that long ago, right, Susan?
Right.
People have to understand their starting point. Not that long ago, we had 0 sports venues downtown. The only market rate housing downtown basically was Riley Towers. I've gone back and looked, and I think there were 375 hotel rooms downtown.
Wow.
Shocking number, right? The theaters that were referred to that are part of our cultural jewels today, Some were triple X theaters or others were shut down. It was just an entirely different place. And the thing that was been so phenomenal about the sports strategy was that it fueled all the rest of it. It did start bringing other people's money here. It created a revenue streams. It created the construction, not just of sports venues, but the convention facilities, which allowed us to bring all this. It's not just sports, right? Ryan's mentioned the convention and trade shows and all that. All these things really fed on each other, but the absolute impetus for it, in my mind, was sports and continues to be so. On volunteers, yeah, it's phenomenal. And I wouldn't start with the Pan American Games, as was mentioned. I'd start with the Olympic Sports Festival, the National Sports Festival. I mean, that was really the thing that gave us all the idea and the organizational principle. And I think Sandy Knapp and Ted Boehm deserve all the credit for it. And maybe a little bit of Peter Uberoth, because we stole some of what was done for the Olympic Games in Los Angeles, where you asked talented volunteers who you could never hire, you could never get them to leave their day jobs, to take real management responsibilities for these big events, and then to go attract and recruit everybody they could get to help. And that still to this day works. The Sports Corp staff has always been phenomenal, but they've really been there to coordinate and to facilitate the volunteer talent that comes together to do these major events. And that means two things in my mind. One, we've never really missed. You couldn't hire that kind of competence to pull off an event. And two, everybody in town gets involved. And we've always tried to do that in a way that was as inclusive and diverse as possible in the process. So everybody could be part of it and everybody could feel proud of it. And that is our special sauce. And, I just can't, we just got to keep doing that. It's a great vehicle to get more and more people involved in their community, to get off their couch at home and get involved civically. And it works for other sectors in our community as well.
Yeah. And, in addition to that, this organizing this special sauce and the civic engagement that John mentioned when he moved to Indianapolis, and the leadership that Susan mentioned from volunteers, part of it is the way we organize them. So Indianapolis absolutely, organized the local organizing committees and the host committees better than anybody else in the country. As Mark said, got the right leaders in place that could make decisions. They were empowered to make decisions, and they rallied the troops across the entire city to get people to work together hand in hand. No matter what your job was or your background was, everybody worked hand in hand together. And, the Pan American Games, I believe, had 30,000 volunteers. For the Super Bowl, we used 12,000 volunteers. And in the meantime, all these other events that we're doing, the NCAA Final Fours, the World Championships, the Olympic trials, we're training all these volunteers in leadership roles and in individual shift roles to be the best they could possibly be. And back to Mark's comment about the city over-delivering. Well, the reason we were over-delivering is we had the right people to do it. And I was the beneficiary of, during the Super Bowl, of people coming up to me on the street saying, listen, if you need anything, even at the last minute for the Super Bowl, here's my business card. And I don't know in what other cities people are doing that. I think not many. I think people are walking up to people saying, hey, if you're running the Super Bowl, can I have a ticket? not, hi, if you need me, call me at the last minute and I'll do anything. So I feel completely blessed with the opportunity all these years to have these volunteers come to us at all these sports events and say, I'll do anything to help. And in my role as president of the Sports Corp and then the Super Bowl, I know for a fact that doesn't happen in other cities, as Ryan and Susan know, because you talk to all these other cities all the time and they say, how do you get these volunteers? Which is completely different than here. So the volunteers, back to Nate, is key strategy, key difference maker for us. And something that's made us be able to execute at the level that we have because of what Mark said. We've got leadership, smart people helping us.
Susan,
I'd like to chime in on that because there are a couple of important points. And that is that, we had a partner at Ice Miller that did all the logistics for transportation. And it was year after year after year. We've got a volunteer that's done the referees and the officials for the Big Tens year after year after year. And they, the officials come, they know these people, they're friendly with them, they're treated like royalty, and that's important. And the coaches know a lot of our volunteers because they see them behind the scenes every year. So that's really, really huge, I think. And it does give us what other cities don't. But there's one thing that I'd like to mention, just so you have it in your mind. We had an organizing committee for some event. I can't remember what it was. And the city of Boston was here watching because they had it next. It was probably a Final Four. And so we had these 6 o'clock meetings or 7 o'clock. I can't remember. It was god awful early. And everybody came together that had an important role that day to make sure to troubleshoot, so on and so forth. And this woman from Boston was just awestruck that the state police, the city police, the DPW people, all those people were in the room eating donuts, slapping each other on the back and cooperating. And she said this would never happen in Boston. Never.
That's for sure.
And so we really can't say enough about just our local law enforcement, public safety, public works people that are there every time, and they really enjoy it. It's not begrudging, it's not anything. They really enjoy it. And I think I saw some quotes in the paper about March Madness, and I think everybody was pumped at City Hall, wherever they might be. So I think that's an important factor.
I might come back to Mark and Allison in terms of whether the IMS and the history of the IMS may have played into some of the volunteer aspect and the sports strategy. But before I do that, Ryan and John, I know we have a ton of events planned over the next 2-3 years, from the All-Star game, John, that you're involved in, to the national championship football game, to many NCAA events. So it feels like we're really hitting, even more of a stride. It feels like in terms of our sports impact and sports economic development strategy. Where do we go from here in terms of actually even doing more? Is there more? I know you mentioned there's 500 corporations out there like ours now or similar going after events. Can we just keep going? Can we keep growing immensely in this area, or are we getting near our maxing out our potential?
Well, I'll jump in here. There's always more, right? We can do more, right? It's the Jim Morris saying, do more, do it better, do it together, right? And there's always room for us to grow on that front. We do have an incredibly busy schedule, but candidly, we have a lot of capacity coming online too. With new hotels going up, we can move from a city that hosts one event to multiple events simultaneously, and really kind of continue to drive that impact. I also think, one of the things that we've been really intentional about throughout the history, but particularly I would say in the last few years, is, viewing the economic impact and the brand building and talent attraction impact of sports beyond just the event, right? The event will always be our first and foremost focus, but, we've done things in the last few years like start a sports tech accelerator and develop businesses and have them relocate to Indianapolis, and they're choosing to do so because of the partnerships we have with all of the professional sports and because of the events that we have. So there are ways, beyond an event itself, where you can be super intentional about growing the impact sports has on our economy, on our talent attraction. And so there's ways to sort of broaden the mission at the same time, continue to deliver at a high level as it relates to events.
John, go ahead.
Kind of in chiming in there, I would add something that Mark and Allison know even more about, but I was certainly a part of it, and that's when we did the Super Bowl, that whole legacy East Side development, and I think that was unique across the country, and it continues today, 9 years later. There's tremendous construction on the East Side, and it's been done in a way that there hasn't been the level of gentrification. So many of the people on the East Side who lived in that community of all economic strata, they're still there. But the community's been uplifted. The housing's better. The streets are better. the restaurant choices, if you haven't gone to the Near East Side for lunch or dinner, you should, because the restaurant choices are greater. And that all came out of the Super Bowl. It continues today, but in a way where it's public and private. So the private developers have come in along with others. So that kind of development in conjunction with sports is, that's another level that we're showing the country. And so when you look at the NBA All-Star game and what was done with the legacy community outreach statewide to put together these community partnerships where these communities get $50,000 to reinvest in their local sports and their young people, to me is another level and a big deal. And it's tying sports more directly into the communities.
Yeah.
Before I go, I had one more economic development comment. Being someone that is in the construction related industries, I hadn't mentioned construction related, the impact on construction of building all these venues. But we did back to back Lucas Oil Stadium, the Convention Center, and then the JW Marriott. And so the companies, the designers, the suppliers, the contractors could roll from one project to the next. And let me be clear, if it wasn't for the JW during the downturn, we would have lost many of our local companies that had been around a long time. I mean, even me, maybe I would have made it without it, but it is not evident from my financials, which were dominated during the downturn by the JW Marriott. So it's had a huge impact on jobs and business for the construction related fields.
Thanks, John.
Can I just add one point for emphasis? I love your question. What's left? What's the trajectory for the strategy that we've been at for a long time now? And I think it's really important because I've heard for years, young people, God bless them, say, well, we've been there, done that. Now we got to do something else because you want to invent something else, right? And even now, I hear people who've been part of the strategy for years saying, well, now with the pandemic, that's dead. People aren't traveling. So we need a whole new strategy. And it's not like this is our only strategy, right? Everybody on this meeting is very aware of the CICP and the cluster strategies for economic development, the other things that the IEDC. But this still has enormous potential, and we're the market leaders. I can't imagine a business leading an industry saying, well, that was good, let's do something else. So I don't in any way mean to suggest that we can only, have to be a one-trick pony here, but I do think it has enormous future growth potential, and we're in a position to just, as Mr. Penske would say, hit the throttle and continue to do more.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, Mark, because that, there is some chatter, and I couldn't agree more with you that we have upward opportunities. Does anybody else want to comment on that piece?
Well, I think the fact that March Madness is here is going to just ramp it all up again. I think people are going to be so excited, even if they can't go to the games. They're going to come downtown. They're going to listen to the music. They're going to look at the art. They're going to do all this stuff. It was, I think, the shot in the arm that we needed, and who'd have thought, but we were there. And with all this competitiveness and all these 500 other organizations around doing sports, it's here, and it's here for a reason. And it's not because the NCAA lives near the White River. It's here because it's here because it's here because it's us, and that just, when I heard that was coming down the pike, I thought, aha, this is going to be what we need to people to come back downtown, to have confidence in downtown, to have confidence in everything we've done. And hats off to Ryan and all the brilliant people that came up with this, because I think it's going to be as important probably as a sports festival, not in terms of volunteers, but in terms of the way the community sees itself again. And so I'm totally excited about that.
Well, since you went that direction, you kind of stole my closing question, but I'm going to jump to it because it's an important one. I've got a few others to talk with you about, but it is unprecedented what we're going to see, and the timing couldn't be better from the perspective of getting downtown back, its groove back, so to say, right? With the challenging year that we've had over the last 12 months, and obviously vaccines are fast in coming, and IMS is leading the way, and with other sites around the state. But the timing is just incredible. So my question is, what does this mean? Susan, you kind of have mentioned this, but for our city and state to do something of this magnitude that's never been done before, to host the entire men's tournament, not only the men's tournament, but I understand the Horizon League tournament is here. The Big Ten championship decided to move from Chicago to Indianapolis. I mean, it really is an unprecedented 5 or 6 weeks. Ryan, maybe you start. What does this mean for, in all of you, please comments for our city and state?
It's an unprecedented moment, at least in my lifetime, where the entire nation and parts of the world will be focused exclusively on the city of Indianapolis for weeks on end, right? I mean, you mentioned it. I mean, starting Monday, the 8th of March through April 5th, we're going to host 100 televised college basketball games. I mean, that's incredible, right? In 6 different venues. We're turning, 2 courts in Lucas Oil Stadium. We'll have 68 teams and 67 games just for March Madness alone. And so at this particular moment where, perhaps no other industry has been hit as hard as tourism, sports tourism during this pandemic. 80,000 workers in the Marion and surrounding counties who work in hospitality, 40% unemployment rate in that industry. People are coming back to work, right? Uber drivers, people at the airport, at the hotels, at the restaurants, companies that have been sidelined, like a sports graphics, that hasn't been able to, do what sports graphic does on scale for a year are coming back to work. And it's just extraordinary. I mean, the branding opportunity, getting people back to work, and then sending the message to the rest of the country that we can do these events well and safe. And it's really time to come back. I also, just outside of the tremendous economic and media moment, and I firmly believe this, and it may sound a little bit sappy, but I think it's there's a real humanity moment to this, right? It's time to quit seeing one another as physical threats to each other. And it's time to start remembering what it's like to be together as a community. And we can do so safely, and we can celebrate that. And so it's just, we're so lucky and so blessed, and so grateful to the NCAA for trusting us with the opportunity.
Others that want to comment on what this means?
Yeah, I just want to add a couple of things. I agree with every single thing Ryan said. I think it's a pivotal moment for our city. And we've had a number of them over the years with the festival that we've talked about, the Pan Am Games, getting the Big Ten football game started, Super Bowl, and so forth. There's been so many, but this one, as Ryan said, 100 games in that period of time. And the reason we're going to be able to do it and do it successfully is because of all these people that we've trained over the years in volunteer roles to be able to take those roles seriously, pull together, put all agendas aside, and do the right thing for the city, the right thing for the state, and in this case, the right thing for the NCAA. And their confidence in us to do that is because of the years and years of them doing events here and believing that we do the best level of execution. In this case, you layer on all the pandemic things. But when I saw that, echoing what Susan said, I was so proud of the city because it is landing at a time when we desperately need it, but it's given to us because the history of being able to execute. And this is complicated, and there's going to take a couple thousand people to get it right, but they're trained, they're ready for the battle, and they're going to do a great job. And it's going to be a great benefit and a pivotal moment for this city going forward.
Well said. I'm gonna harken back a little bit again. Historically, when I used to and I still do, and we all do travel, and we're going to be doing more of it hopefully soon, travel internationally. But in the early days of my international travel, when I happened to spend time in the former Soviet Union, and when I would say I'm from Indiana, where's Indiana? The only thing I know about Indiana, there were two things: the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, Indianapolis 500, of course. And at that time, it happened to also be Indiana basketball, Bobby Knight. Now, that's a long time ago. We got a big Indiana-Purdue game that I'm a little worried about today. But now, Mr. Roger Penske, who's an incredible business person, has come into the picture. And at the time, maybe no one said it. Kind of going way back to the early sports strategy. We were known as sometimes Indy no place, right? Or Indy no place versus Indianapolis. And I don't think anybody says that anymore for all the reasons you just talked about. I'm curious, when you think about the motor speedway and you think about IndyCar and what growth opportunities exist there, how you see that fitting into all the sports strategies we've been talking about, and where we might see more economic growth and impact given the recent transaction and the work that Mark, you and Allison are doing.
Well, we could talk for the rest of the time about that. Roger's the perfect owner for these assets at a very challenging time, and he and his family will be for as far forward as anybody can see. And everything that's going to happen in March and the beginning of April, to me, as phenomenal as it is, kind of becomes prelude for May. And I don't mean to suggest that one's more important than another, but it clearly will create enormous momentum so that we can have the opportunity for the most normal May imaginable. So that's another ramification of March Madness and the Final Four being here. Look, this place is going to continue to grow. Roger, he put another $17 million into the facility, knowing pretty much that we weren't going to be able to sell tickets for the 500. So under incredibly dire economic circumstances, under any other circumstances, he was still pressing the pedal, and it hasn't stopped. Now we're working on the golf course because it's a great asset, not just for golfers, but to bring people to our city and to give them a world-class experience at the Brickyard Crossing. And IndyCar is going to benefit as well. IMS does well if IndyCar does well, and vice versa. And I just can't tell you how satisfying and exciting it is that he's at the helm. So the race will continue to be more and more nationally prominent. The series will continue to get more and more national audience. And then eventually we can think about that more traditional view of economic development, which is, of course, development. And we own a fair amount of property around here. None of us have set an agenda for, the next 54 acres on the south side of 16th Street will be developed into this purpose in this time frame. But the day is coming. We got to get downtown Indianapolis back on its feet and where it was, and absorb the new investment that's coming. But then I think I can see the day, I hope to see the day, when there's a great kind of development connectivity between downtown Broadly Writ and Speedway. And John was kind enough to mention the legacy. Well, what can we do on West 16th Street and the neighborhoods impacted by that business corridor? And there's just so much opportunity. We got to sort of recover from all that's happened in the last year, get to where we get momentum again in our key businesses. But then I think you'll see a broader economic impact, in large part enabled by Roger's ownership of these assets.
Allison, you want to add anything on that front?
No, just maybe a couple thoughts quickly. Roger has been amazing. And as Mark said, in this downturn, with the pandemic, we're ready to go and gearing back up and have what I believe to be a really bright future in looking at the business differently, expanding our footprint across the city. And you look at the history of the Indy 500, and I remember standing there when we were getting the bid for the Super Bowl in 2012. And a number of the discussion after was, well, we know you can do it because you've had the Indy 500 all those years. That's the world's single day largest sporting event. We know you can do the Super Bowl. So the history of the 500 has played into all the events that we've gotten because it shows annually we can execute. And I think that impact is only going to grow going forward.
And I do think it's important to note that there wouldn't have been a sports strategy but for the Indy 500, because when you're trying to think about opportunities, you always take a look at what you're good at. And you know, we've been good at the Indy 500 forever. And so that really was the impetus, I think, for the sports strategy. And so we can't forget that. I just think that's sort of day one for us.
Certainly part of our Hoosier heritage, and certainly auto manufacturing and racing and technology. We've done it all here in the state, and I couldn't agree more. So this is you've all been involved, each one of you to some degree, and most of you, all of you, really in the details and the weeds in economic development for our city and for our state. And you just heard, and you told me that we were first to have a sports corp. John, you said we were first to have the City Classic that you mentioned. This is a little bit of a non-sports question. Given the changing world that we live in, we just went through this year where we all are doing what we're doing right now, Zooming and working remotely more. And we know some of these trends are going to be not just trends, but they're going to be long lasting in terms of how people work and where they decide to live. And these are important questions for any city and state and country to figure out. What else can we be first in? What is there? Do any of you have any ideas where we certainly don't want to give up the sports strategy? I know you've all made that clear, and that makes sense. But what else can we be first in and maybe lead like we have in sports?
You know, Nate, I want to tie together a couple questions you had before. You had the question about the motor speedway. You had a question about going forward, and then your current question. But I still have sports in there. And Ryan said something earlier too about technology and startups and the whole bit. But right now, Indianapolis Motor Speedway, 2 of CICP's portals or verticals, ESN, which is Energy Systems Network, and Connexus, along with the IEDC, have this autonomous challenge going on. And we have competitors from across the world in this competition, and the winner is going to get $1.5 million, you know, so it's a real serious effort. I mean, MIT's involved in this. I mean, the participants are stellar from across the globe. And so there is an intersection of sports, technology, that can and entertainment that can really be developed here. And we can be unique in that. We have all the ingredients for that. I mean, so we're talking about doing it in racing, and just like we bought, you know, we have Delara out there building what are really high-tech body parts for the Indy cars. But there's just a whole world of technology that we can grow in with sports. And whether, you know, most people think of apps, as we deploy 5G, and the state have a leadership role there. We have a 5G lab downtown at the IEDC has stood up, and we have 912 down there kind of overseeing that 5G lab. And so many organizations from around the world are testing their software to make sure that their software and hardware work with other platforms in 5G. And there's a place for that in sports as well. And while I may not have all the ideas, we've got to create the ecosystem where the young people who are developing those ideas come to Indiana to really develop them. You know, so there's an intersection there that can be the next step. And we're best positioned to do it because of our sports. And then the other part of your question, just about what else other than sports, there's a lot happening in advanced manufacturing in terms of the Internet of Things, so that I have a Caterpillar backhoe. I get an email that says, hey, you need to service this part. It has about another 1,000 hours before it goes up. And so all of the preventive maintenance is done. 3D printing. And Indiana is uniquely positioned to big data analytics in manufacturing, collecting all the data and making all of the machines work seamlessly together. The digital thread, so that the entire supply chain can deploy new technology quickly because we're all following the same digital thread. That's new. The Department of Defense is really getting that going, but it's going to permeate all manufacturing. But advanced manufacturing outside of sports is how you do it. But sports still feeds it, because that's how you attract and retain companies, using your sports. And so anyway, just some thoughts, closing thoughts.
Are we on time? Can I pipe in on that?
Please, yeah.
I love the way John thought about it. You've written about it. The autonomous challenge is the coolest thing ever. It's not sport, right? The sport's always kind of what you see, but the rationale and the benefits are usually different. It's about the connection to 30 of the best engineering schools, students, and faculties around the world who are participating and competing. I can't wait for the public to understand this story. Imagine these cars, they're basically Indy Lights chassis powered with conventional power, but there's no driver. And it's not like there's somebody in the pagoda with a joystick. The race is between the software. So this is all preordained, and that car has to be run by the software that powers that car. And they're going to be going maybe 200 miles an hour wheel to wheel. I can't even imagine it can work, but shame on me for being Luddite. Anyway, it's about the young people and the brain power. And in shorter answer to your question, I do think we will end up with a big opportunity going forward around kind of technology and mobility. And I'm not talking about racing, although we hope racing as a sport continues to thrive and we can maintain our position and grow our position in that. But there's something between technology, our community getting more and better and better and better at assembling capital and being entrepreneurial, our universities, Roger's connections directly to the CEOs of every OEM that makes cars in this country, like speed dial kind of connections. All those things can come together, and I think there can be a new initiative that it's hard to even know exactly what it's going to look like, but it's somewhere around creativity and innovation, entrepreneurship, and mobility that's technology driven.
And I'd like to just chime in real quick. I don't understand any of this technology stuff. It's passed me by. But what I do understand is this young talent that we're talking about that's going to be the next generation of creating all these ideas and stuff. We do want them here. And what I'm finding is that my new neighbors downtown are from two sectors. They're either from technology or they're from life science. Right next door, they're redoing the house next door, are medical people. And they want to live in an urban center. They want to walk to Pacer games, walk to the symphony. They want to do all that stuff. And so we need to be very mindful of what's happened to our urban center during this pandemic, and that we can't let it slide, because that is a huge attractor. These kids can work anywhere and still be employed in Indianapolis, at Salesforce or wherever they are. We want them to live here. We want them to be part of our organizing committees. We want them to be part of our volunteer areas, because we need that creativity, those creative ideas that are going to take Ryan make him smarter and take him to the next place. And some of us oldies might even get smarter. I don't know, but it's important. And so I've always been an advocate for our urban core. I think now more than ever, we want to make this a place where people want to live.
Anybody else want to jump in on that last question?
I just want to add on the urban core, I agree with Susan completely. It's been a strategic advantage to us for years. Part of the reason the Super Bowl was so successful was because we did create a nucleus area. Most of the other Super Bowls prior to Indianapolis were very spread out, Miami, Phoenix, and so forth. They spread out, all across their city. We centered it, and now that's the model. And we've got to take care of our downtown and our urban core. And as we're coming out of this pandemic, for every resident and civic leader, it's a priority.
Right.
Yeah, well, for the benefit of your viewers, I should probably yield my time to John. I learn so much every time he speaks, but I would just echo Susan's comments. I was with Jim Morris earlier this week, and he had a pretty salient point. He said downtown is Indiana's neighborhood. It's where everybody comes to convene and to be together. And I really actually started to think about that on a bigger scale. Like, could Indy become America's neighborhood? Right? I mean, with the change and attitudes of people working from home, as Susan was talking, like, a lot of people now believe and have proven to themselves and to their companies that they can work from anywhere. If we can create that affordable, high quality of life in our downtown, we can be that hub of talent where people can experience great life in an affordable way. And that would be so enriching for all of us and our community to attract those people.
Well, you all have been fantastic. And what I want to do is thank you for all that you've done for our city and state. Each of you has contributed in so many significant ways. The latest, Ryan, as was mentioned, your and your colleagues plan to host basketball in this city last September, to be have so much foresight to think about utilizing the assets that so many of these folks on the call were very big part in building. And for what we're about to experience is an advantage for our city that no other city in the country has. And to kickstart our state's economy, our city's economy, it's going to be incredible opportunity. And timing couldn't be better with vaccines coming quickly, and then as Mark said, and Allison, followed by the Indianapolis 500. I think from just an energy perspective and getting us in our city back to work, we have an opportunity like no other place on the planet. So a lot of that, the reason for that is for each of you, the work that each of you has done through the last number of decades and more recently, and all of you continue to do it. So thank you on behalf of our city. And thank you for participating in this hour-long call with the IBJ.